The bet was simple, born from whiskey and the kind of careless cruelty that festers in bored, prideful men. It was a wager on who could stomach the ugliest, most pathetic mail-order bride for a full calendar year. Cormac, whose pride was a sharper and more dangerous thing than any of his companions possessed, intended to win. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to make a statement, a monument to his own audacity. So he searched the back pages of gazettes for the bleakest possible prospect. He found her in a smudged photograph accompanying a listing written in spare, desperate prose. Plain face, stout frame, no family to speak of, willing to travel. She was perfect. The perfect punchline. Her name was listed simply as Agnes. When the stagecoach deposited her at the edge of his dust-choked ranch, she looked even more suitable for his purposes than the photograph had promised. She was wider than he'd imagined, dressed in a brown wool garment that had seen a decade of hard wear, and she held a single, battered trunk. His friends, who had ridden out to witness the glorious punchline, snickered behind their hands. Cormac felt a surge of vicious triumph. He strode forward, not to greet his new wife, but to begin the performance. He did not offer to take her trunk. He simply stared at her, letting the silence and the weight of his friends' derision press down. She met his gaze without flinching, her eyes a steady, clear grey. This unnerved him slightly, this lack of practiced timidity, but he pressed on. The joke required a finale for its first act. He was a rancher, he had told himself, and a rancher culls the herd, strips away the worthless hide to see the bone beneath. This was his justification. This was the lie he used to paper over the rot in his own character. He intended to strip her of everything, to show his friends and this plain woman exactly what she was, nothing. A beast of burden he had purchased for sport. He would show her that she owned nothing here, not even the dignity of a name. He gestured to the dusty porch where his friends were now openly laughing. "Welcome to your new home," he said, his voice dripping with a theatrical sarcasm that earned a fresh round of chuckles. He pointed a thumb at the assembled men. "These are my neighbors. They've come to see the prize I won." Agnes's gaze swept over them, cool and assessing, before returning to him. She said nothing. Her silence was a canvas, and he was eager to paint it with his cruelty. "Let's see what worldly treasures you've brought with you," he sneered, grabbing the handle of her worn trunk. He dragged it to the center of the yard and kicked open the rusted latch. He reached in and began pulling out her meager possessions, tossing them into the dirt. A spare dress, patched at the elbows. A small, well-worn Bible. A packet of seeds. A tin containing 3 needles and a spool of dark thread. A single, polished river stone. His friends howled with laughter at the pathetic display. He was stripping her bare, metaphorically, showing her and the world that she had arrived with nothing and was therefore nothing. "Is this it?" he demanded, holding up the mended dress. "This is the dowry you bring to my house." He felt powerful, the architect of this perfect humiliation. He stood, wiping the dust from his hands, ready to deliver the final, crushing blow. He would not call her by her name. He would give her a new one. "You'll work for your keep. Cook, clean. You'll start in the barn. We'll call you Bessie." Like the cow, he waited for her to break, for the tears to come. Instead, she knelt, calmly gathering her scattered things with a steady hand. She placed each item back in the trunk, her movements deliberate and unhurried. When she was finished, she closed the lid, stood up, and faced him. Her grey eyes held his, and for the first time, he saw something in them that wasn't fear or humility. It was a cold, hard fire. "My name," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying across the silent yard, "is Agnes Rosewood." Cormac froze. The laughter died in his friends' throats. Rosewood. It was his mother's maiden name. It was the name of the aunt his family had disowned and erased, the woman who had married a poor dirt farmer for love, the woman his father had derided as a fool but his mother had secretly mourned as the strongest of them all. He stared at the woman before him, and the cruel joke curdled in his stomach, turning to ash in his mouth. The world tilted on its axis. The smug triumph of a moment before collapsed into a dizzying void of confusion and a shame so profound it was physically sickening. Rosewood. The name echoed in the silent space between them, a ghost from his own history he had long since been taught to forget. He remembered fragments of stories his mother had told in hushed tones, tales of her sister, the other Rosewood girl, a woman with hands that could calm a spooked horse or coax life from barren soil. A woman who had chosen a life of hardship and love over the comfort and propriety of her station. He looked at Agnes, at her calloused hands now resting on her trunk, at the unyielding line of her jaw, and he saw not a punchline, but an inheritance. His friends, sensing the abrupt and inexplicable shift in the atmosphere, shuffled their feet and mumbled their farewells, slinking away like coyotes from a sudden fire. They left him alone with the woman who was his wife, his cousin by a bloodline he had scorned, and the living embodiment of his spectacular, catastrophic miscalculation. He could not speak. The words he had planned, the orders he had intended to bark, were lodged in his throat, choked by the name she had uttered. He turned without another word and stalked into the ranch house, slamming the door behind him. He went straight for the bottle of whiskey, but the liquor offered no comfort, only amplifying the bitter taste of his own actions. He had set out to humiliate a stranger, and in one stroke, he had desecrated his own history. Through the grimy window, he watched her. He expected her to leave. He almost hoped she would take her trunk and walk back down the dusty road, freeing him from the suffocating weight of his shame. But she didn't. She stood for a long moment, then picked up her trunk and walked not to the main house, but to the dilapidated servants' quarters out back, a small, sagging shack he hadn't used in years. She disappeared inside. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful sight he couldn't appreciate. The house was silent. She did not come to cook his dinner. She did not come to ask for instructions. She simply remained in her shack, a quiet, powerful presence that seemed to judge him from across the yard. That night, Cormac slept poorly, haunted by the image of her steady grey eyes and the echo of a name that bound her to him in a way he had never intended. He had wanted a joke, a thing of no consequence. He had gotten a reckoning instead. Days turned into a week, and a week into a month. An oppressive silence settled over the ranch, broken only by the wind and the sounds of Cormac's own solitary, aimless movements. He treated Agnes as if she were invisible, a ghost he had inadvertently summoned. He left food supplies on the porch of her shack, flour, salt pork, beans, and otherwise avoided her completely. He was waiting for her to break, to give up and leave. He told himself this was what he wanted. But she did not break. She built. The first thing he noticed was the sagging porch step on her little shack. One morning, it was no longer sagging. It was firm and level, braced from underneath with a piece of scrap wood he hadn't even realized was usable. Then, he saw her on the roof, hammering down loose shingles with a rock, her movements economical and sure. He watched from the window of his house, hidden like a coward, as she methodically repaired the structure he had abandoned to rot. She did not ask for tools. She found what she needed, discarded nails she straightened with a stone, a rusted hatchet head she sharpened and fitted with a new handle carved from a fallen branch. Her resourcefulness was a silent rebuke to his own neglect. The ranch, his inheritance, was failing. The fences were down, the well was running low, and the fields lay fallow. He had spent more time in the saloon, nursing his pride and his resentments, than he had spent working the land. He saw the slow decay as an injustice, a curse from a god he didn't believe in. But now, watching Agnes, he began to see it for what it was, the direct result of a weak and lazy character. His character. One afternoon, he came back from a pointless ride to find his favorite work shirt, which he'd torn on a barbed wire fence and discarded in a fit of pique, lying folded on his porch. He picked it up. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of stitching so fine and even it was nearly invisible. It was stronger than the original fabric. He ran his thumb over the mend, a strange and unfamiliar emotion stirring in his chest. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was a profound and unsettling confusion. She owed him nothing. He had offered her nothing but scorn, had tried to strip her of her very identity. Yet here was this act of quiet restoration. She had taken something broken and made it whole. He looked from the mended shirt in his hands to the small, sturdy shack across the yard, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the chasm between the woman he had thought he'd acquired and the woman who was actually there. The land around the ranch was parched and cracked, starved by a relentless drought that had plagued the territory for 2 seasons. Cormac had long given up on the kitchen garden his mother had once tended, a patch of earth that was now just a square of pale, lifeless dust behind the main house. He saw it as another testament to his misfortune. But Agnes saw it as a challenge. He began to see her out there in the cool hours of early morning and late evening, breaking up the compacted soil with a pointed stick and a discarded shovelhead she had fixed. He scoffed privately, convinced it was a fool's errand. Nothing could grow in that cursed dirt. He watched her haul buckets of water, not from his dwindling main well, but from a small, muddy seep she had found half a mile away at the edge of his property. It was back-breaking work, and he observed her toil with a detached, cynical curiosity, waiting for her to admit defeat. She never did. Slowly, miraculously, the patch of dust began to transform. Green shoots appeared, then unfurled into leaves. She had used the seeds from her trunk, planting rows of hardy beans, squash, and potatoes. She built a small, crude fence around the plot with salvaged wire and fallen branches to keep out the rabbits. The garden became an island of vibrant green in a sea of brown. Its existence defied the drought, defied his own bitter resignation. Then came the day he found her standing at the bottom of a dry creek bed, studying the ground with an intensity that made him pause. He watched from a distance as she spent the next week digging in that spot, not with frantic energy, but with a slow, patient rhythm. He assumed she had finally gone mad from the heat and the isolation. He was about to ride into town for whiskey when he heard it, a shout. It wasn't a shout of fear, but of triumph. He ran toward the sound and found her standing waist-deep in the hole, covered in mud, water pooling around her ankles. She had found a new spring, a source of clean, sweet water bubbling up from the earth. She had done what his father, and his grandfather before him, had never been able to do. She had found more water. That evening, as he sat on his porch, he saw her watering her flourishing garden not with murky seep water, but with clear, fresh water from the new well. The sight filled him with a powerful, disorienting mix of awe and shame. This woman, this joke, was breathing life back into his dying land. She didn't speak of her accomplishments. She didn't need to. The evidence was there in the repaired step, the mended shirt, the green garden, and the gurgle of new water. She didn't break. She built. And in doing so, she was systematically dismantling the ugly caricature he had tried to make of her. The larder was getting low, and Cormac knew he could no longer put off the trip into town. The thought of it filled him with a cold dread. He would have to be seen with her. The architects of his cruel wager would be there, waiting, eager to mock him, to ask him how he was enjoying his prize. He considered leaving her behind, but the list of necessities was long, and he knew, with a certainty that shamed him, that she would be a far better steward of their dwindling cash than he would. She would know which flour was best for the price, which salt was coarsest, which vendor wouldn't cheat them. He told her in the morning, his words clipped and impersonal. "We're going to town. Be ready in an hour." He didn't look at her when he said it. She simply nodded. When she emerged from her shack, she was wearing her other dress, the one he had thrown in the dirt. It was immaculately clean and pressed, though he had no idea how she'd managed it. Her hair was neatly braided. She carried a basket woven from reeds she had gathered by the creek. She looked plain, yes, but also immensely dignified. The wagon ride was silent. When they arrived, the town was just as he'd feared. His former friends were loitering outside the general store. They saw the wagon and began to snicker, their eyes crawling over Agnes with undisguised contempt. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," one of them called out. "Enjoying married life, Cormac." Cormac felt a hot flush of anger, but it was a different kind of anger than before. It wasn't directed at her, but at them. And at himself, for ever seeking the approval of such men. He said nothing, tying off the horses and moving to get down. Agnes, however, paused. She looked directly at the men, her gaze so steady and clear that they actually fell silent. She did not offer a retort. She did not show any sign of hurt or anger. She simply looked at them, and in her quiet, powerful gaze, they seemed to shrink, their taunts exposed as the pathetic, childish things they were. She then slid from the wagon seat with a practiced grace and walked toward the store, her back straight, her head held high. Inside, he watched her move through the aisles. She inspected goods with an expert eye, bartering with the store owner, Mr. Henderson, with a quiet firmness that earned his respect. She traded a dozen eggs from the chicken she had coaxed back into laying and 2 meticulously repaired harnesses for a discount on their supplies. Henderson, who had always treated Cormac with a veiled condescension, spoke to Agnes as an equal. Cormac stood by, a silent, useless observer, witnessing the woman he had intended to be an object of ridicule command respect through sheer, undeniable competence. On the ride home, the shame was a physical weight in his chest. He had invited the world to laugh at her, and she had met that laughter with a dignity that silenced it completely. The first frost had silvered the land when the banker came to call. Mr. Hemlock arrived in a polished black buggy that seemed offensively out of place against the backdrop of the struggling ranch. He was a thin man with a face like a clenched fist, and he carried a leather satchel that radiated an aura of doom. Cormac had been dreading this visit for months. The loan his father had taken out was long overdue, and Cormac had made no progress in paying it down. He had drunk most of the last of his money away, chasing a sense of control he had never truly possessed. Hemlock stepped down from his buggy and surveyed the property with a predator's eye. His gaze lingered on the neat, thriving garden and the newly patched roof of the main barn, work Agnes had directed and Cormac, in a grudging admission of necessity, had helped with. An improvement, Hemlock noted, his voice dry as dust. "I'm surprised. I heard you'd taken on a wife." He said the word wife as if it were an insult, a synonym for another burden. At that moment, Agnes came around the side of the house, carrying a basket of potatoes from her garden. She stopped when she saw the banker, her expression unreadable. Hemlock gave her a dismissive, once-over glance, taking in her plain dress and work-worn hands. He clearly categorized her as a non-entity. "Cormac," he said, turning his back on her completely, "we need to talk. The bank's patience has run out. The note is due." Cormac's stomach tightened. He knew what was coming. Foreclosure. The loss of the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. It was the culmination of all his failures. "I need more time," he said, his voice weaker than he wanted it to be. The drought is everyone's problem," Hemlock cut in sharply. "But your neighbors are managing. You are not. The board has decided to call in the debt. You have 30 days to pay in full, or we will take possession of the property for 30 days. It was a death sentence. He had nothing. Less than nothing. As despair began to wash over him, he felt a presence beside him. Agnes had set down her basket and come to stand at his shoulder. She did not touch him, but her proximity was a solid, grounding force. Hemlock noticed her and sneered. "Don't look to her for help. What's another mouth to feed going to do for you?" For the first time in his life, Cormac felt a surge of genuine protective instinct. He straightened his shoulders. "She is my wife," he said, the words feeling foreign and momentous on his tongue. He had never called her that before. Hemlock simply laughed, a short, barking sound of contempt, before climbing back into his buggy and riding away, leaving the 30-day ultimatum hanging in the cold air between them. That night, for the first time since she had arrived, Cormac did not retreat into his house and she into her shack. They stood in the yard as the last light bled from the sky, the banker's threat a tangible thing between them. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of impending doom. The ranch, the land, his name, it was all about to be stripped away, a humiliation far more profound than the one he had tried to inflict upon her. He was the joke now. A failed man about to be wiped off the map. He finally turned to her, the pretense of his authority, of his superiority, completely shattered. He looked at the woman who had mended his home and his clothes, who had found water and coaxed life from dead soil. He saw not the stout, plain woman he had chosen for a bet, but a pillar of strength. "What do we do?" he asked. The question was a surrender. It was an admission of his own inadequacy and a plea. It was the first time he had ever asked her for anything, the first time he had used the word we to mean the two of them. Agnes looked at him, her grey eyes seeming to search his face in the twilight. She could have turned her back. She could have reminded him of his cruelty, of the fact that this failure was his and his alone. She owed him nothing. But the Rosewood women, as his mother had once whispered, did not abandon their own, no matter how foolishly they behaved. "We work," she said. Her voice was simple, declarative, and held not a trace of triumph or malice. It was a statement of fact, the only fact that mattered. And with those two words, the dynamic between them shifted forever. The next morning, she was waiting for him at sunrise with a ledger book he hadn't seen before. It was old, one his father had used, but the pages were filled with her neat, precise script. She had been keeping track of everything. Every egg sold, every penny saved by mending instead of buying, every projected yield from her garden. She had also been talking to the other ranchers' wives in town, gathering information about market prices, about hemlock, about the bank. She laid out a plan, not of desperation, but of strategy. They would harvest the potatoes and squash immediately. They would sell the 2 yearling steers he had been holding onto. They would use the water from her well to barter with a neighbor whose own well had run dry, trading water for help in a premature harvest. It was a daunting, almost impossible plan, requiring every ounce of their energy for the next 30 days. For the first time since his father's death, Cormac felt a flicker not of despair, but of purpose. He nodded. "All right," he said. "We work." The 30 days were a blur of relentless labor. Cormac had never worked so hard in his life. He rose before the sun and fell into his bed long after dark, his muscles aching with an exhaustion that was, for the first time, satisfying. He worked alongside Agnes, taking his direction from her without question or resentment. He found that she understood the land in a way he never had. She knew which soil needed turning, which animals needed tending, which tasks were most urgent. She moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed to multiply her efforts. There was no wasted motion, no wasted word. Their silence was no longer one of hostility, but of shared purpose. They were a team, united against the ticking clock of the bank's deadline. He learned more from her in that month than he had in a decade of his own indolent ownership. He learned how to properly brace a fence, how to read the signs of sickness in a calf, how to ration grain to last the winter. More than that, he learned the meaning of resilience. He watched her hands, cracked and bleeding from the work, never falter. He saw the weariness in her eyes at the end of each day, but never a hint of surrender. His respect for her grew into a quiet, burgeoning awe. He started leaving a bucket of hot water on her porch each evening. He began taking the heaviest loads without being asked. Small, unspoken gestures of a change that was taking root deep in his soul. The day of the deadline arrived, grey and cold. Hemlock's black buggy rolled up the lane precisely at noon. This time, Cormac did not wait for him on the porch. He and Agnes walked out to meet him together. They stood side by side, a united front. Hemlock dismounted, a smug, predatory smile on his face. He carried foreclosure papers in his hand. "Time is up, Cormac," he said, his eyes flicking to Agnes with disdain. "I trust you've packed your things." Cormac felt a tremor of the old fear, but then he felt Agnes shift her weight beside him, a small, grounding movement. He held his ground. "We have a payment for you," he said, his voice steady. Hemlock laughed. "A payment? Don't be absurd. You couldn't possibly have the full amount." It was then that Agnes stepped forward, holding her ledger. "No," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Not the full amount. But we have a substantial payment, a verifiable projection of income for the next quarter, and something else you may have overlooked." Hemlock's smirk faltered as Agnes opened the ledger. She didn't present it as a plea, but as evidence. Her finger traced the neat columns. "Here is the revenue from the sale of 2 steers, 30 bushels of potatoes, and 50 bushels of squash, sold at premium due to the drought. Here is the contract with the Miller Ranch for water rights, paid in advance for the next 6 months. Here is the payment from the town livery for the repair of 3 sets of harnesses. It comes to 1/3 of the outstanding debt. We will pay the remainder in 2 installments before the spring thaw. The banker looked stunned, his smugness evaporating into disbelief. He snatched the ledger and his eye scanned the figures, searching for a flaw. This is impressive, he stammered, but it's not enough. The board demands payment in full. Agnes did not waver. It is enough to prevent a foreclosure proceeding from being profitable for your bank, she stated calmly. And there is the matter of the deed. She pulled a folded, yellow document from her pocket, the original land grant. I found this in the cellar. I assume you are familiar with the riparian rights clause of 1874, article for inch. Hemlock's face went pale. That's an archaic, unenforceable, it is neither, Agnes interrupted, her voice gaining a sharp edge of authority. It states that any landowner who discovers a new, year-round water source on their property is entitled to redraw their property lines to include the full watershed. My spring feeds the creek that runs through the Miller property and across the land. The railroad has already paid your bank a hefty sum to acquire for their new spur line. If we enforce our claim, and we will, their project will be stalled in court for years. It would be inconvenient. For everyone a dead silence fell. Cormac stared at her, his heart pounding. She had not just saved the ranch with hard work, she had outmaneuvered a predator with sheer intelligence. She had found a weapon in a dusty old book and was now wielding it with the skill of a master swordsman. Hemlock looked from Agnes's unyielding face to Cormac's resolute one. The banker saw a unified strength he had not anticipated, a partnership forged in adversity. That stout farm wife he had dismissed was a formidable opponent, and her quiet, disgraced husband stood ready to back her play. The fight went out of him. He saw years of legal battles, angry railroad barons, and a board of directors demanding to know how he'd let this happen. He slowly folded the foreclosure papers and put them away. I will present your payment and your proposal to the board, he said, his voice tight with fury and defeat. I expect the next installment in 90 days. He turned without another word, climbed into his buggy, and fled. As the buggy disappeared, Cormac turned to Agnes. The immense weight of his past, his failures, and his shame had been lifted, not by his own strength, but by hers. The joke he had played was now a stunning, humbling miracle. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. It was rough and calloused, but it was the strongest hand he had ever held. Agnes, he said, her name a prayer on his lips. My wife. The words were a vow, a confession, and a beginning. She simply squeezed his hand in return, and in that touch, a new story for the ranch, and for both of them, truly began.